The man reading the newspaper had killed 17 people. He sat 3 feet away, across the aisle of the Brussels to Paris express train, completely absorbed in an article about European economic integration. His coffee steamed gently in the plastic cup holder. His leather briefcase rested against his knee. His gray suit was expertly tailored. To everyone else in the carriage, he was just another businessman making the morning commute between 2 European capitals. But Ezra Cohen knew exactly who he was, and that knowledge was about to destroy 6 years of careful intelligence work, unless Ezra could control the adrenaline now flooding his system and making his hands shake. It was March 14th, 1991, 8:43 in the morning. The train had left Brussels Central Station 16 minutes earlier and was now cutting through the flat Belgian countryside at 160 kilometers per hour. Ezra had boarded planning to use the 90-minute journey to review his cover story for a meeting with French banking sources in Paris. His actual mission was recruiting a Hezbollah financial facilitator who worked in the international transfers department of a bank near the Opera. It was delicate work that required absolute focus. He'd spent 3 weeks preparing. Now none of that mattered, because sitting across from him, casually turning the pages of Le Monde, was the man Mossad had been hunting since 1985, the man they called the Red Prince. Born Hussein al-Hadi to a wealthy Lebanese family with communist sympathies and aristocratic pretensions, trained by Soviet intelligence in East Germany, recruited by Black September after the Munich massacre, and responsible for coordinating terrorist attacks across Europe throughout the 1980s. Bombings in Rome, Paris, and Vienna, assassination attempts against Israeli diplomats, weapons smuggling networks that supplied multiple terrorist organizations. He was the logistics genius behind operations that had killed dozens and wounded hundreds. And then in 1985, after a bombing in Rome that killed 3 people but missed its intended target, Hussein al-Hadi had vanished. Mossad assumed he'd fled to Lebanon or Syria. They'd tracked possible sightings in Beirut and Damascus. They'd monitored his family's communications. They'd recruited sources within organizations he'd worked with. Nothing. For 6 years, one of the most wanted terrorists in Israeli intelligence files had been a ghost. Until this moment. Until Ezra had glanced up from his briefing documents and seen a face he'd studied in dozens of photographs during training sessions. Older now, with gray touching his temples. Wearing expensive European clothes instead of the casual attire he'd favored in surveillance photos from the 1980s. But unmistakably him. The same distinctive nose slightly crooked from an old break, the same deep-set eyes, the same way of holding his head, tilted slightly to the left when reading. Ezra forced himself to look back down at his own papers. His heart was hammering so hard, he was certain everyone in the carriage could hear it. He had no weapon. Carrying a gun through European train stations was impossible for someone traveling under commercial cover. He had no backup. His handler didn't even know he was on this train. He had no secure way to communicate what he was seeing, and he had approximately 74 minutes until they reached Paris, where Hussein al-Hadi would disappear into a city of 2 million people. Every instinct Ezra had developed through 8 years as a Mossad field operative was screaming at him to act, but he had no idea what action to take. For 6 years, Hussein al-Hadi had been invisible. Understanding why that mattered requires understanding who he'd been before he disappeared and what he represented to both his allies and his enemies. The man Mossad called the Red Prince wasn't a fighter. He'd never personally planted a bomb or pulled a trigger. His contribution to the Palestinian cause was far more valuable. He was the person who made operations possible. The coordinator, the facilitator, the man who could move money, weapons, and operatives across borders without leaving traces that security services could follow. Black September had officially disbanded after the Munich Olympics massacre in 1972, at least on paper. In reality, the organization's network had simply gone deeper underground, operating through layers of front groups and intermediaries. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, attacks attributed to various Palestinian factions were often coordinated through networks that traced back to former Black September operatives. Hussein al-Hadi had been part of that hidden infrastructure. He'd been recruited in 1976 while studying economics at the American University of Beirut. His family's wealth and connections gave him access to banking systems and business networks. His communist ideology, inherited from his father, who'd been involved in Lebanese leftist politics, gave him motivation, and his natural talent for organization and detail made him invaluable. Soviet intelligence, which maintained close relationships with various Palestinian groups during the Cold War, had recognized his potential. They'd brought him to East Berlin in 1978 for 6 months of training. Not military training, but operational security, communications tradecraft, financial manipulation, document forgery, and network management. The skills needed to run clandestine operations across multiple countries. When he returned to Beirut, he'd been transformed from an idealistic university student into a professional intelligence operative. Over the next 7 years, Hussein had coordinated operations across Europe. He never claimed credit. Most of the terrorist attacks attributed to various Palestinian groups during that period had no clear organizational signature, but Israeli intelligence had been piecing together the pattern. The same financial networks, the same document forgery techniques, the same weapons supply chains. They'd identified Hussein as the common link through signals intelligence and information from captured operatives. By 1984, Mossad had a thick file on him and had elevated him to high-priority target status. The nickname came from a captured operative during interrogation. Describing Hussein's role in the network, the operative had said he operated like a prince, coordinating everything from a distance, never getting his hands dirty, protected by layers of subordinates. The red part came from his political ideology and from the blood spilled in operations he'd organized. Mossad officers had started calling him the Red Prince in classified briefings. The name stuck. The 1985 Rome bombing had been designed to kill an Israeli diplomat during a reception at a hotel near the Spanish Steps. The bomb had detonated prematurely, killing 3 hotel staff and wounding a dozen guests, but missing the intended target who'd been delayed in traffic. Italian intelligence had responded aggressively, rolling up Palestinian networks across Italy. Several operatives were arrested, and Hussein al-Hadi had vanished. Mossad assumed he'd fled back to the Middle East. They'd tracked his family in Beirut, monitored communications with known associates, and distributed his photograph to field stations across Europe and the Mediterranean. They'd intercepted conversations suggesting he was in Damascus, then Beirut, then possibly Tehran, but nothing solid, no confirmed sightings, no definitive intelligence. He'd gone to ground so completely that some analysts began to suspect he'd been killed. His death kept quiet by organizations that didn't want to admit the loss of such a valuable operative. For 6 years, the Red Prince had been a ghost. And now, here he was, reading a newspaper on a morning train to Paris, apparently living openly in Europe under an identity that had fooled border security and allowed him to move freely between countries. The implications were staggering. Ezra Cohen stared at the financial reports in front of him without seeing them. His mind was racing through probability calculations. What were the odds that he would randomly board the same train as one of Mossad's most wanted targets? The Brussels to Paris route carried thousands of passengers daily. Ezra's decision to take this particular train at this particular time had been routine operational planning. His meeting in Paris was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon. Taking the 8:27 departure gave him time to arrive, check his security, and prepare. There'd been nothing special about the choice, and Hussein al-Hadi's presence seemed equally random. He wasn't acting like someone on a mission. He'd boarded casually, bought a coffee from the cafe car, settled into his seat with the relaxed manner of someone making a routine journey. This wasn't operational movement. This was commuting, which suggested something almost more disturbing than the original disappearance. Hussein wasn't hiding in some safe house in Damascus. He was living openly in Europe, confident enough in his cover identity to travel between major cities on public transportation. Ezra risked another glance across the aisle. Hussein had finished his coffee and was now making notes in the margin of his newspaper. His pen moved with quick, precise strokes, a businessman annotating articles relevant to his work, except his work was coordinating terrorist operations. What was he planning? What networks was he currently running? How many operations might be in motion right now, coordinated by the man sitting 3 feet away? The protocol for this situation was clear. Observe, identify, report, and wait for instructions. Field operatives didn't make tactical decisions about high-value targets without authorization from headquarters. The risks were too great. Acting without approval could compromise other operations, trigger diplomatic incidents, or result in losing the target entirely if the approach was mishandled. Ezra knew the protocol. He'd been trained on it extensively. The problem was that following protocol required secure communications, and Ezra had no way to contact headquarters that wouldn't potentially expose him. His cover identity for this mission was Daniel Rousseau, a financial consultant based in Brussels who specialized in European market integration. He had a Belgian passport, a full background that would survive standard investigation, and a cover story that justified regular travel between Brussels and Paris. But secure communication required either dead drops, which were useless on a moving train, or encrypted phone calls from predetermined secure locations. The nearest secure phone was in Paris, at a safe house Mossad maintained in the Marais district. Using any other phone risked compromise, which meant Ezra couldn't report what he was seeing until the train reached Paris, and by then Hussein might disappear into the city before Ezra could establish surveillance. Paris was Hussein's destination, that much was clear from his ticket on the seat beside him. But where in Paris? To what address? To meet whom? Ezra had no way to know and no way to find out without following. Following an intelligence target without backup was dangerous. Following one of the most experienced operatives in Palestinian terrorism was potentially suicidal. Hussein had spent years evading security services. He would be trained in counter-surveillance. He would know how to spot a tail. If Ezra made any mistake, if Hussein noticed he was being followed, the entire advantage of this accidental discovery would be lost. Worse, Hussein would know that Mossad had identified him. He'd disappear again, this time more carefully. But the alternative was unacceptable. Letting Hussein simply walk away, hoping to find him again through traditional intelligence work, would waste an opportunity that might never come again. The train was approaching Lille, the first stop before Paris. Hussein showed no signs of preparing to disembark. He was continuing to Paris, which gave Ezra approximately 50 minutes to decide what he was going to do. 50 minutes to choose between following protocol and potentially losing the most significant intelligence opportunity of his career, or breaking every rule he'd been taught and following Hussein into Paris alone. Every instinct screamed at him to act. Ezra's training had prepared him for ambushes, for interrogations, for violent confrontations in dark alleys, but nothing had prepared him for this. Sitting motionless in a train carriage, pretending to read financial reports while one of the most wanted terrorists in the world sat 3 feet away drinking coffee. The psychological challenge was immense. His body was flooded with adrenaline that demanded action, fight or flight responses hardwired into human biology, but he could do neither. He had to sit perfectly still and appear completely normal while his heart rate climbed and his hands trembled slightly against the papers he was pretending to read. Ezra had been with Mossad for 8 years. recruited from military intelligence after his service in Sayeret Matkal, Israel's elite special forces unit. He'd been selected specifically for European operations because of his appearance. With his light brown hair, green eyes, and features that could pass for French or Belgian, he could blend into European environments in ways that operatives with more obviously Middle Eastern features could not. His French was native level, learned from his mother who'd grown up in Paris before immigrating to Israel. His operational training had been extensive. Surveillance, counter-surveillance, weapons, communications, cover identity development, and psychological conditioning. That conditioning was being tested now. One exercise during training had involved sitting in a cafe while instructors staged increasingly alarming scenarios around him. A fake police raid, a simulated shooting, actors pretending to recognize him. The goal was to train operatives to maintain cover under stress, to not react instinctively when every nerve was firing. Ezra had passed those tests, but those had been exercises. This was real. The man across from him represented years of Israeli intelligence effort. Capturing or eliminating Hussein al-Hadi would be considered a major operational success, the kind of success that could define a career, but operational success required patience. Ezra forced himself to breathe slowly and deeply. He turned a page of his report at the appropriate time, maintaining the rhythm of someone actually reading. He took a sip of his own coffee, which had gone cold. He glanced out the window at the Belgian Schimte, countryside passing by, flat fields and industrial zones exactly as a bored businessman might do, all while watching Hussein from his peripheral vision. Looking directly at someone repeatedly was one of the first mistakes surveillance operatives made. Human beings are remarkably good at detecting when they're being watched. Eye contact triggers subconscious awareness. So Ezra kept his eyes on his papers, on the window, on anything except the man he was monitoring. Hussein shifted in his seat, crossing his legs. He folded his newspaper and placed it on the empty seat beside him. He checked his watch, a gold Rolex that probably cost more than Ezra earned in 6 months. Then he stood up. Ezra's pulse spiked. Was he getting off at Lille? Had he somehow sensed surveillance? Hussein reached into the overhead luggage rack and retrieved a briefcase. He opened it, removed a different newspaper, and sat back down. The briefcase went back overhead. Hussein began reading again. Just a man switching from one paper to another during a train journey. Nothing suspicious, nothing unusual. But Ezra's hands were shaking so badly now that he had to grip his papers tighter to hide it. The train was slowing. Lille station approached. 45 minutes until Paris. The train bathroom was barely large enough to turn around in. Ezra locked the door and stared at his reflection in the small mirror above the sink. His face looked pale despite his attempt to appear calm. He ran cold water over his wrists, an old technique for lowering heart rate. Then he pulled out his phone. Not his personal phone, which would be compromised if examined. His operational phone, which had a Belgian number registered to his Daniel Rousseau identity and contained nothing that would contradict his cover story. But it could make calls. And right now, Ezra needed to make a call that protocol said he absolutely should not make. Mossad's communication protocols existed for good reasons. Operational phones were assumed to be monitored by multiple intelligence services. Using them for anything except cover-supporting communications risked exposure. The proper procedure was to use secure phones at predetermined locations or in emergencies, to use coded messages through dead drops or intermediary contacts. Direct calls to headquarters from operational phones were forbidden except in cases of immediate physical danger. This situation didn't qualify. Ezra wasn't in danger. He'd simply identified a target. That discovery was valuable, but not worth compromising communication security. Except the standard protocols assumed he could wait to report. They assumed he had time to reach a secure phone, make contact through proper channels, and receive instructions. In this situation, waiting meant losing Hussein. By the time Ezra reached the safe house in Paris and made a secure call, Hussein would be gone, disappeared into a city of 2 million people with no way to track him. The opportunity would be lost. Ezra stared at his phone, weighing the decision. If he called his handler directly, even using coded language, it would flag his operational phone. Any intelligence service monitoring that number would know something significant had happened. They might not know what, but they'd know Daniel Rousseau, supposedly a financial consultant, had made an urgent call that suggested he was something more than his cover claimed. But if he didn't call, he was making the decision to follow Hussein alone, without authorization, without backup, without any support if something went wrong. That violated every principle of operational security Mossad had drilled into him. Field operatives didn't freelance. They followed orders and protocols because intelligence work required coordination across multiple operations and geographical areas. What seemed like an isolated decision could have cascading effects on operations Ezra knew nothing about. His handler might have critical information about Hussein's current activities. There might be other operatives already tracking Hussein. There might be political considerations that made any action inadvisable right now. Ezra composed a text message. Coded, brief, nothing that would be obviously suspicious to someone monitoring the number. Meeting delayed, unexpected opportunity, will update evening. It was vague enough to mean almost anything to anyone intercepting it, but his handler would understand that something unplanned had occurred. It wasn't proper protocol, but it was something. He sent the message and deleted it from his phone immediately. Then he splashed more water on his face and returned to his seat. Hussein was still reading. The train had left Lille and was now approaching the final stretch into Paris. 30 minutes remaining. Ezra tried to think through what would happen when they arrived. Paris Nord Station was one of the busiest in Europe. Hundreds of thousands of people passed through it daily. Multiple exits, metro connections, taxi stands, bus stops. Tracking someone through that chaos would be nearly impossible without a team. Hussein would know that. If he suspected any surveillance, the station would be where he'd attempt to lose it. Ezra had no team. He had himself, his limited cash, and whatever operational improvisation he could manage. It wasn't enough, but it was what he had. Paris Nord Station was chaos by design. 400 trains daily, 700,000 passengers passing through every 24 hours. The station had been built in the 1860s and renovated multiple times, creating a maze of platforms, corridors, shops, and exits that confused even regular travelers. For someone trying to lose surveillance, it was perfect. Multiple levels, multiple exits, constant crowds that could obscure sightlines. Ezra knew all of this as the train glided into Platform 9 at 11:37 in the morning. He also knew he was about to attempt something that had a very high probability of failure. Hussein stood as the train slowed, retrieving his briefcase from the overhead rack with the practiced ease of a frequent traveler. He didn't look around, didn't check for followers, just moved toward the door with the crowd. Ezra waited 3 seconds, then followed, keeping 4 other passengers between them. The doors opened, people flooded onto the platform. Hussein turned right, walking at a steady pace toward the main terminal, not rushing, not dawdling, the pace of someone who knew exactly where he was going and had done this journey many times before. The platform emptied into the main hall, a vast space with a vaulted glass roof that let in gray morning light. Electronic departure boards hung above the crowds. Shops lined the edges. Hundreds of people moved in different directions, pulling luggage, checking phones, meeting friends. Ezra kept Hussein in sight, maintaining distance but never letting him disappear behind the crowd. This was the critical moment. If Hussein was going to employ counter-surveillance techniques, it would be now. A sudden stop to check if anyone behind him also stopped. A quick reversal of direction to see who followed. A move into a shop with only one entrance, forcing anyone tailing him to either follow obviously or lose sight. But Hussein did none of these things. He walked straight through the main hall toward the metro entrance. The Paris metro connected to Nord Station with multiple lines going in different directions across the city. If Hussein entered the metro system, tracking him would become exponentially harder. Ezra would need to stay close enough to see which line he took, which direction, which stop he exited at. One moment of distraction, and Hussein would vanish into the underground warren of tunnels and platforms. Hussein descended the stairs into the metro. Ezra followed, now only 2 people behind, closer than he wanted to be but necessary to maintain visual contact. The metro station was crowded with morning commuters. Hussein moved to the ticket machines. Ezra's mind raced. He didn't have a metro ticket. Buying one now would mean taking his eyes off Hussein, but trying to jump the turnstiles would draw attention from security. Hussein purchased his ticket and moved through the turnstile. Ezra made a decision. He moved to the adjacent ticket machine, inserted coins, punched buttons without looking, grabbed the ticket that emerged, and pushed through the turnstile. The entire process took maybe 15 seconds. He looked up frantically, scanning the crowd. Hussein was gone. The corridor split in 3 directions. Signs indicated different metro lines. People moved in all directions. Ezra felt panic rising in his chest. He'd lost him. 15 seconds of distraction, and Hussein had disappeared. He moved forward quickly, looking down each corridor, searching for the gray suit and the distinctive way Hussein carried his briefcase. Nothing. He was gone. Then Ezra saw him, not in the metro corridors, but ascending a different staircase, not going down into the metro system at all, but going up toward a different exit. It had been a feint. Hussein had entered the metro area, creating the impression he was taking the underground, then doubled back to a different exit. Basic counter-surveillance, the kind of thing anyone concerned about being followed would do routinely. Ezra followed, climbing the stairs 2 at a time, emerging into morning sunlight on Rue de Dunkerque. Hussein was 30 meters ahead, walking toward the taxi stand. You cannot follow a taxi on foot. This is one of the fundamental problems in surveillance work that no amount of training can solve. A person walking can be followed by another person walking. A person on a metro can be followed through the metro system, but a person in a taxi traveling through city traffic at unpredictable speeds to an unknown destination cannot be followed by someone on foot. The mathematics simply do not work. Ezra watched Hussein approach the taxi queue at the front of the station, and he knew he had perhaps 30 seconds to solve an impossible problem. Running to the queue would draw attention. Hussein might notice someone rushing to get a taxi immediately after him, but waiting meant losing him entirely once his taxi pulled away. Ezra walked quickly but not frantically toward the taxi stand. Hussein was 3rd in line. 2 other passengers were climbing into cabs ahead of him. Ezra reached the queue as Hussein's taxi arrived. Hussein spoke briefly to the driver, placed his briefcase in the back seat, and climbed in. The taxi pulled away into traffic. Ezra stepped to the next taxi, opened the door, and made a decision that would either work or expose him completely. He climbed in and spoke in rapid French to the driver. I need you to follow that taxi, the gray Peugeot that just pulled out. My wife is in that car. She thinks I am still in Brussels on business. I need to know where she is going. It was absurd. It sounded like something from a bad movie, but Ezra had learned that the most ridiculous cover stories sometimes worked because they were too stupid to be lies. He pulled out a €100 note and held it where the driver could see it. Please, I will pay whatever the fare is, plus this. Just do not lose that taxi. The driver, a heavy-set man in his 50s with gray stubble, looked at Ezra in the rearview mirror. For a long moment, Ezra thought he would refuse. Then the driver shrugged with the particular French expression that suggested life was absurd, and why not participate in its absurdity. Your wife, she is in the gray Peugeot? He pulled into traffic. "We follow, but I cannot break laws. If police stop us, you explain." Ezra nodded, relief flooding through him. They merged into the heavy morning traffic on Boulevard de Magenta. Hussein's taxi was 4 cars ahead, visible but not close. Paris traffic was notoriously unpredictable. Cars moved in aggressive patterns, cutting between lanes, accelerating and braking suddenly. Ezra's driver kept pace, maintaining distance, but never losing sight of the Peugeot. They passed through intersections, turned onto Boulevard de Sebastopol, then toward the Seine. Hussein's taxi wasn't rushing. It moved at the steady pace of a driver following directions to a specific destination. 15 minutes into the journey, they crossed the river and entered the 8th arrondissement. Expensive neighborhood, wide boulevards, elegant buildings, high-end shops. Hussein's taxi turned onto a smaller street lined with residential buildings. 5- and 6-story structures with the characteristic cream-colored stone facades of Parisian architecture. The taxi slowed, then stopped in front of a building midway down the block. Hussein exited, paid the driver, and entered the building through a heavy wooden door. Ezra's driver continued past without slowing, turned at the next corner, and stopped. "Your wife enters that building," the driver said. "You want I wait here?" Ezra handed him the €100 note plus another 50 for the fare. "No, thank you. You have helped me very much." He exited the taxi and walked back toward the building Hussein had entered, but slowly, approaching from the opposite direction. The street was quiet, morning in a residential neighborhood, a few people walking dogs, an elderly woman carrying shopping bags, nothing suspicious about a man in a business suit walking down the sidewalk. Ezra noted the address, 47 Rue de Mossad. He continued past the building, memorizing details. 6 stories, well-maintained. A brass plaque beside the entrance listed 8 apartments. No business names, purely residential. The wooden door was closed. It would require either a key or someone inside buzzing visitors in. Across the street was a small cafe with outdoor seating despite the cool morning temperature. 3 tables occupied by people drinking coffee and reading newspapers. Ezra made another decision. He crossed the street and sat at an empty table. A waiter appeared. Ezra ordered coffee and a croissant. The waiter disappeared. Ezra positioned himself with a clear view of 47 Rue de Mossad. Now came the hardest part. Waiting, watching, hoping Hussein would emerge again so Ezra could follow him further, or hoping someone else would arrive or depart, giving more intelligence about who lived in that building and what operations might be running from it. He checked his watch, 12:15. His meeting with the Hezbollah financial facilitator was scheduled for 2 o'clock. He would miss it. That operation, 3 weeks of careful preparation, was now sacrificed. His handler would be furious, but that did not matter anymore. Over the next 6 hours, Ezra watched people come and go from 47 Rue de Mossad. He nursed 3 coffees and 2 sandwiches, apologizing to the waiter each time for occupying the table so long. He claimed he was waiting for a friend who kept delaying their meeting. The waiter, with Parisian indifference, seemed uninterested in his explanations. At 1:30, a woman in her 30s entered the building. Dark hair, wearing a long coat and carrying shopping bags. She looked Lebanese or Syrian. She used a key to enter, suggesting she lived there rather than visiting. At 2:45, an older man emerged. Gray beard, glasses, conservative dark suit. He walked with a slight limp favoring his left leg. He turned right and disappeared around the corner. Ezra photographed none of this. Taking photographs would be too obvious if anyone was watching from the building. Instead, he used the technique he'd been trained in, intensive observation and memory. He studied every person, noting details he could later use to search Mossad's databases. The woman's shopping bags were from Monoprix, a common supermarket chain, suggesting routine daily activity rather than anything operational. But the older man with the limp triggered a memory. Ezra had seen his photograph somewhere in the files he'd reviewed, not recently, but during training years ago. one of the thousands of faces connected to Palestinian or Lebanese militant organizations that operatives were expected to memorize. At 3:20, two men in their 20s arrived together. They spoke Arabic on the sidewalk before entering the building, loud enough that Ezra could hear fragments of conversation from across the street. One of them was complaining about parking. They entered using a key, residents or regular visitors. At 4:10, the woman who'd arrived earlier emerged with different clothes, now wearing jeans and a leather jacket. She walked quickly toward the metro station at the end of the block. At 4:55, a man Ezra recognized with absolute certainty exited the building. His name was Mahmoud Rashid. Ezra knew this because Mahmoud's photograph was in the high-priority target files, not as important as Hussein al-Hadi, but significant. Mahmoud was wanted by French intelligence for involvement in a 1988 bombing in Paris that had killed 2 people. He disappeared after that attack, assumed to have fled to Lebanon or Syria, and here he was, walking out of a residential building in central Paris like he lived there, like he had no fear of arrest, like he was operating freely in a city where he should have been one of the most wanted men. This was not a safe house where Hussein was hiding. This was an active cell. Multiple operatives living or working from this location, operating in the open with false identities good enough to rent apartments and move freely through Paris. The implications made Ezra's hands shake as he lifted his coffee cup. This was bigger than finding Hussein. This was discovering an entire network that Israeli and French intelligence had no idea existed. How many people were in this building? What operations were they planning? How long had they been here? At 6:30, as evening darkness settled over Paris, Hussein emerged. He'd changed clothes, now wearing casual slacks and a sweater instead of his suit. He walked to the corner, hailed a taxi, and departed. Ezra remained at the cafe. Following Hussein again would risk exposure. He'd already followed him from the train station to this building. Doing it again increased the chances Hussein would notice the same person appearing multiple times. Better to stay here and observe. Better to gather more intelligence about this location and the people using it. At 7:15, Mahmoud Rashid returned carrying a bag from a nearby restaurant. Take-out food. He entered the building. At 8:30, lights went on in third-floor windows. Shadows moved behind curtains. At 9:20, Ezra finally stood up, paid his bill with an apologetic tip for occupying the table all day, and walked to the nearest metro station. He needed to reach the safe house in the Marais. He needed to make the call he should have made 9 hours ago. He needed to report what he'd found. His legs were stiff from sitting all day. His back ached. His eyes burned from hours of focused observation. But his mind was racing with the magnitude of what he'd discovered. The cafe waiter, clearing Ezra's table, noticed he'd left a newspaper folded on the chair. On its margins were scribbled times and brief descriptions, in handwriting so small they were almost illegible. The waiter threw it away without looking closely. The safe house in the Marais occupied the 3rd floor of a 17th-century building on Rue des Rosiers. From the outside, it looked like any other apartment in the historic Jewish quarter of Paris. Inside, behind a door with 3 separate locks, it contained secure communication equipment, false documents, emergency cash, and weapons. Ezra arrived at 10:45 that night, exhausted and starving. He'd eaten nothing since the sandwiches at the cafe. His first action was to activate the secure phone line, a system that routed calls through multiple encrypted relays before reaching Mossad headquarters in Tel Aviv. His handler, a woman named Rachel, whom he'd never met in person and knew only by voice, answered on the second ring. "You missed your meeting." Her tone was flat, dangerous. Missing an operational meeting without prior authorization was a serious violation. It suggested compromise, capture, or betrayal. "I need to hear an excellent explanation in the next 30 seconds, or this call ends, and you are considered burned." Ezra spoke carefully, using the proper authentication codes to prove his identity. and confirm the line was secure. Then he explained everything: the train from Brussels, the recognition of Hussein al-Hadi, the decision to follow, the apartment building on Rue de Monceau, the other operatives he'd observed, including Mahmoud Rashid. He spoke for 8 minutes without interruption. When he finished, there was silence on the line for several seconds. "You are absolutely certain about Hussein al-Hadi?" Rachel's voice was different now, focused, intense. "You understand that if you are wrong, if this is mistaken identity, you have burned your cover and compromised an operation for nothing?" Ezra had been asking himself the same question for 12 hours. Could he be wrong? Could his recognition on the train have been a mistake, triggered by stress or expectation bias? He'd reviewed every detail in his memory dozens of times during the long afternoon at the cafe. The face, the mannerisms, the way Hussein held his head when reading. He was certain. "I am certain," he said. "It is him." Rachel gave him the address on Rue de Monceau and told him to repeat everything he'd observed. Every person who'd entered or exited, every detail he remembered. She was recording now, creating the official report that would go to senior officers and analysts. When Ezra finished the second recounting, Rachel said, "You will stay at the safe house. Do not return to that location. Do not attempt any further surveillance. A team is being assembled. They will arrive in Paris within 48 hours. You will brief them on everything you observed. After that, you will be reassigned. Your cover as Daniel Rousseau is probably compromised by your actions today. We will determine the extent of the damage and decide your next posting." Ezra felt a flash of anger. He'd just handed Mossad the location of one of their most wanted targets, plus an entire operational cell they'd had no idea existed. And Rachel was treating it like he'd committed a disciplinary violation. But he kept his voice neutral. "Understood. What about French intelligence? They will want to know about Mahmoud Rashid. He is wanted for the 1988 bombing. We will coordinate with French liaison, but that is not your concern. Your concern is staying in the safe house and waiting for the team." The line went dead. Ezra sat in the small kitchen of the apartment, eating stale bread and cheese from the emergency supplies, and tried to process what would happen next. 48 hours for a team to arrive. That was fast by intelligence standards, but it felt like an eternity. Hussein and the others would be at that apartment for 48 more hours. Or they might leave tomorrow. They might scatter if they sensed any surveillance. They might disappear again into whatever network had kept them hidden for 6 years. Ezra wanted to go back to Rue de Monceau immediately. Wanted to maintain surveillance to ensure they didn't lose this opportunity. But orders were orders. He'd already violated protocol by following Hussein without authorization. Going back now would be insubordination that could end his career. So he stayed in the safe house, sleeping fitfully on the narrow bed, waking every few hours to imagine what might be happening at 47 Rue de Monceau. At dawn, he made coffee and waited. By 8 in the morning, his patience broke. He left the safe house and took the metro back to the 8th arrondissement. He told himself he was just checking, just making sure the building was still there, just verifying that nothing had changed overnight. The cafe across from 47 Rue de Monceau opened at 9. Ezra was the first customer. By the time headquarters responded with a coordinated plan, it was too late. Ezra had maintained his unauthorized surveillance for 2 more days, watching the building from various positions around the neighborhood, rotating between the cafe, a nearby park bench, and a bus stop that offered a clear sight line. He saw Hussein leave twice, both times in the evening, both times returning within a few hours. He saw Mahmoud Rashid coming and going on what appeared to be a regular schedule. He saw the 2 younger men who spoke Arabic. He saw the woman with dark hair. He documented everything in his memory, knowing he couldn't write anything down without risking compromise if he was stopped and searched. On the 3rd morning, everything changed. Ezra arrived at his observation position at 7:30 to find the building dark. None of the usual patterns of morning activity. No lights in the third-floor windows. No one entering or exiting. By noon, he was certain the apartment was empty. The cell had moved. Whether they'd detected surveillance or simply completed whatever operational cycle had brought them to Paris, they were gone. Ezra felt the failure physically, like a weight in his chest. He'd found them and lost them. The team from Tel Aviv arrived that afternoon, 6 officers with diplomatic cover who'd flown in on commercial flights over the previous 48 hours. They met Ezra at the safe house. Their team leader, a man in his 40s named Asher, listened to Ezra's report with growing frustration. "You were ordered to stay here." Asher's voice was controlled but angry. "You were specifically instructed not to return to the location, and you disobeyed, maintaining surveillance for 2 additional days, during which time the targets disappeared. Do you understand that your presence, your repeated observation of that building, likely tipped them off? Do you understand that we have lost not just Hussein al-Hadi, but an entire cell because you could not follow orders?" Ezra had no defense. Asher was right. His unauthorized surveillance had probably been detected. Some small mistake in his tradecraft, some moment of carelessness after hours of observation had alerted the cell. They'd evacuated. They were gone. The French intelligence liaison, when finally briefed, was equally angry. The Direction de la Surveillance du Territoire, France's counterintelligence service, needed 48 hours to obtain legal authorization for surveillance of the building. They needed to coordinate with judicial authorities, prepare documentation, arrange technical monitoring. They could not simply storm a building in central Paris without proper legal foundation. When they finally obtained authorization and entered 47 Rue de Mossad, they found exactly what Ezra had feared: empty apartments. Furniture remained, suggesting the leases were still active, but no people, no documents, no equipment. The occupants had left cleanly, taking everything that might identify them or indicate what they'd been doing. French forensic teams processed the apartments anyway. They found fingerprints, DNA traces, fibers, and residues. They found evidence of occupancy by multiple individuals. But without suspects to compare against, the forensic evidence was useless. They found no weapons, no explosives, no communications equipment, nothing illegal that might justify arrests, even if they could identify who'd been living there. The cell had been professional. They'd maintained perfect operational security until the moment they evacuated. Ezra was recalled to Tel Aviv 3 days later. He expected disciplinary action, expected to be removed from field operations, possibly dismissed from Mossad entirely. He'd disobeyed direct orders. He'd potentially compromised an operation through his actions. Instead, he was brought to a classified briefing room where senior officers showed him something he hadn't expected. Analysis. The apartment building on Rue de Mossad had been under French surveillance before, years earlier, based on separate intelligence about Lebanese nationals operating in Paris. The surveillance had been discontinued when French analysts concluded the residents were legitimate business people with no connection to terrorism. The fingerprints and DNA recovered from the apartments, when run through international databases, matched several individuals wanted for terrorist activities across Europe. Most significantly, they matched samples recovered from bombing sites in Rome, Paris, and Vienna during the 1980s. Cross-referencing the physical evidence with utility records, lease agreements, and financial transactions associated with the apartments revealed a network. Bank accounts that connected to other accounts in Belgium, Switzerland, and Lebanon. Phone records that showed patterns of communication between Paris, Brussels, Beirut, and Damascus. Travel records that indicated the apartment's occupants had been moving regularly between European cities for years. The intelligence picture that emerged showed that Hussein al-Hadi hadn't been hiding after his 1985 disappearance. He'd been building a network of operatives living under deep cover across Europe, maintaining legitimate businesses and residences, operating with patience and professionalism that had kept them invisible to intelligence services for 6 years. 3 months after the empty apartments were discovered, French and Belgian police conducted coordinated raids across both countries. The raids were based on intelligence developed from the Rue de Mossad, evidence combined with intensive surveillance that followed. They arrested 14 people in Paris, Brussels, and Antwerp. They seized documents, communications equipment, and enough weapons and explosives to indicate multiple attacks had been in planning stages. Among those arrested was the woman with dark hair whom Ezra had observed. She was identified as Leila Hamdi, wanted by Israeli intelligence for involvement in attacks during the First Intifada. She provided information during interrogation that led to further arrests in Germany and Italy. Hussein al-Hadi was not among those arrested. Neither was Mahmoud Rashid. Both had vanished again, presumably warned by the cell's evacuation from Paris. But the network they'd built was broken. Operations they'd been planning were disrupted. Connections between Palestinian militant groups and European support networks were exposed and severed. The intelligence value was enormous, all stemming from Ezra's accidental encounter on a morning train from Brussels. He'd disobeyed orders. He'd violated protocol. He'd lost the immediate target. But the thread he'd pulled had unraveled an entire network that intelligence services had been blind to for years. Asher, the team leader who'd been so angry in Paris, was the one who explained this to Ezra during the briefing in Tel Aviv. "Intelligence work is not about what you do in the moment," Asher said. "It is about what happens afterward. You found Hussein by accident. You followed him against orders. You lost him through surveillance mistakes. Every procedural criticism of your actions is valid, but you also gave us the address that broke open a network we did not know existed. Sometimes in this work you lose the battle, but win something else, something bigger that you could not have predicted." Ezra was reassigned to a different operational area. His cover as Daniel Rousseau was retired, considered compromised. He was given a new identity, new documentation, new mission parameters. He never saw Hussein al-Hadi again. Years later, he learned through classified channels that Hussein had been killed in Beirut in 1998, killed not by Israeli action, but by rival Palestinian factions in an internal dispute. Mahmoud Rashid was captured in 2003 in Syria and extradited to France, where he was tried and convicted for the 1988 bombing. The story of the train encounter became part of Mossad training programs, taught to new operatives as an example of how intelligence work actually functions, not through dramatic confrontations or perfect executions of planned operations, but through accidents, opportunities, mistakes that lead to unexpected discoveries and the patience to follow threads, even when immediate results seem like failures. Ezra's decision to follow Hussein, despite violating every protocol, despite losing the target, despite the operational chaos it created, had provided intelligence that shaped counterterrorism efforts for years. And somewhere in classified files, there is a photograph of 47 Rue de Mossad, just an ordinary Parisian building on an ordinary street. Nothing about it suggests it was once the center of a terrorist network, or that its discovery came from one operative's choice to stay on a train and watch a man read a newspaper. Intelligence work, Ezra learned, is less about the dramatic moments than about recognizing what you are looking at when chance puts it in front of you, and having the judgment to know when following your instincts matters more than following the rules. He had sat 3 feet from one of the most wanted terrorists in the world and made a series of choices that seemed like failures at the time, but became victories through consequences he could not have predicted. That is the nature of the work: patient, imperfect, hidden, and far more complex than any operation planned in advance could ever be.